Today's episode is brought to you by Create Engage, the specialist digital marketing agency for the disruptive management consultancy. Now, for long-time listeners, you will probably already know who we are. You may have even heard one of our ads on a previous episode of this podcast. But for those of you who don't, here is a short introduction. At Create Engage, we help you create an effective marketing strategy for your consultancy, a strategy that will resonate with your target clients. And then we support you by delivering the campaigns you need to turn that strategy into a reality, helping you to build your brand, raise your profile with your prospective clients, and ultimately generate return on investment from your marketing activity. Now, I could tell you about many of the great clients that we work with and the results we've delivered for them. But instead, I'm going to do something much more powerful and something that I would recommend you do for your own marketing. I'm going to let our clients do the talking for us. If you are currently thinking about marketing for your consultancy, you're going to want to listen to this.
Create Engage started the process for us. They managed it end to end. They came up with some really creative ideas and we were really happy with the work that they did, which meant that we could just focus on running the business. Not only did we start conversations with clients that we hadn't spoken to before, but also there was tangible return on investment by some work that we were given.
They've helped right from the initial shaping of the idea through to helping us work out what our end goal was. They've supported us with the visual identity and our positioning of the brand.
We've had an immediate expansion of our network and have initiated a raft of new conversations with owners, CEOs in target client organisations, and has led to us winning new projects already.
One of the greatest compliments, I guess, is that one of our competitors even said that they really like what we're doing with marketing. They wish they could be doing something as good.
So from our perspective, we couldn't recommend Create Engage any more than this.
I would certainly recommend Create Engage if you're a consulting firm. They really understand consultancies and the sort of challenges we face. And I don't think you're going to get much better marketing anywhere else.
So I wouldn't hesitate to recommend Create Engage. They did a really good job for us.
So if you're looking for an agency that can help you achieve the results that our clients just described, then head to our website, createengage.co.uk, where you can find out more about how we support consulting firms like you. You can download our latest ebook and you can get in touch to talk about how we can help you take your consultancy to the next level through digital marketing. Hi, and welcome to Climate Consulting. In this conversation, I speak to Andy Zimmerman, CEO of Journey. Now, it's safe to say that Andy has had a fascinating career at the cutting edge of our industry. He was responsible for launching Accenture's new business division, better known today as Accenture Interactive. He turned around the leading global design agency Frog, not once, but twice. And now he is running one of the world's first consultancies, tackling the challenges of customer experience in the metaverse, Journey. But Andy's story isn't just one of hard-charging corporate success. It is a journey of self-reflection and self-discovery that led him to places that he never thought he'd go, and gives a powerful case study of the benefits of understanding who you are and bringing your true self to your professional as well as your personal life. In this one, Andy and I explore this fascinating career journey and the ups and downs along the way. We talk about his personal experiences over the last 10 years and how a trip to Glastonbury changed his life. We talk about his success in leading Frog not once, but twice, and the secrets to turning that business around both times. We explore why his early startup experience was critical to his success with Accenture New Business and what consultancies like yours can learn from that startup mentality. And finally, we talk about his latest venture, Journey, why he launched the business and how they're helping global brands to tackle the challenges of engaging customers in the metaverse and Web 3.0. Andy shares so much brilliant advice in this episode to help you succeed in your career and live the life you want. So whether you are early on and trying to decide if consulting is for you, or maybe you've reached the top of your firm and you're still not feeling fulfilled, you're going to get so much from listening to what Andy has to say. So with the intro done, all that's left to say is please enjoy my conversation with Andy Zimmerman. Andy, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Nick. Looking forward to talking with you.
Well, we've got a lot of ground to cover, Andy, and quite a lot that I've never spoken to any guest before about, which is always exciting for me. But before we do, it'd be great for my listeners to help them place you. If you could give a quick overview of your background and how you got to where you are today.
Sure. Well, I grew up in the States, in Pennsylvania, and originally was involved with the arts and wanted to be a writer, and actually studied writing and had a fellowship for a year traveling with circuses in Europe to write a novel about the experience. And then I realized I had to make a living, and writing is a tough way to make a living. And so I actually went to business school in New York and went into the accounting consulting profession, originally with Coopers & Lybrand, then PwC, and ran different parts of consulting there, including e-business back in the dot-com period. Then got involved with Idea Lab, which is an incubator that really the first big incubator for incubating dot-com companies. And then spent 10 years at Accenture, where, among other things, I started up Accenture Interactive and Accenture Mobility, which ultimately became Industry X. And then ran a small design firm called Frog, basically over a 7-year period. And Frog, of course, is one of the iconic 50-year-old firm that's well known for the work it's done with Disney and Apple and so forth. And then last year, or the beginning of this year, actually left Frog to start up a new company, private equity backed, called Journey. So always have been in the technology services, professional services space. Always been a little bit involved in like the next wave of what's out there in technology, and always lived in the States, either in New York or on the West Coast.
Fantastic. Well, I think a very succinct overview for what has been quite a long and varied career, Andy. And I didn't realize, I want to ask you about the book you did write, but I didn't realize there was a book earlier in the journey in the circus as well. Why don't we, to start with, and maybe just because you didn't mention it, and we'll come on to everything you did, including, and I was looking on your LinkedIn earlier and I saw the recent project you did with Walmart that I do want to come on to, but I'll sort of tease that for our listeners and we can hold that till the end. Something you've done that's quite unusual for my guests, and I asked this and it's going somewhere for our listeners, but is actually the book that you've written. So I don't think you wrote the circus book, I might be wrong, but you've obviously written your sort of novel. And maybe to start with, could you share what that is and what led you to write it? Because I think it's a really interesting discussion for other consultants who've kind of got those other passions, as it were.
Sure. Yeah, I wrote a novel. I hadn't mentioned always wanting to be a writer and never letting go of that. But obviously moving into business and being very busy, I kind of gave up that part of my life. And then I went through a bit of a personal and spiritual awakening, which had to do with meeting someone who was a healer who worked with me to sort of help me kind of take on a better perspective about my life and who I was and so forth. And it was quite an emotional experience. And in this experience, she told me that you will write a book about it, which I kind of said poo-pooed at the time. But then I did start writing, and I decided not to write a memoir for kind of personal reasons and other reasons, but to write a novel, to write a work of fiction, drawing upon some of the actual what happened in my life, but making it fictional, frankly, also to make it more entertaining. My life isn't maybe as entertaining or James Bond-like as maybe if I use a novel. Now, it happened to take place in a company called Ascendant, which, of course, is very similar to Accenture. And I was writing this originally while I was at Accenture. And so I kind of had fun with the fact that, a bit of it's about Accenture and politics and what it's like in being a big management consulting firm. But it really was about a person's life's journey and how they began to rethink what's important, to spiritually evolve. And the name of the novel is Journey, which happens to be the name of the company that I now am CEO of, that I started up later this year. So ultimately, I have, managed to achieve one of my life objectives, which was to be a writer. It is a trilogy. I'm hoping to finish the second one called Journeying early next year. And then the third one is called Journey's End. The first one was the #1 bestseller on Amazon for 2 weeks in metaphysical fiction and won an award from the Soul and Spirit magazine, which is a magazine that kind of covers, spiritual types of fiction and nonfiction. So I keep my day job. You don't make money writing. That's one thing I learned. But it's just a thrill for me, and I have such respect for anyone who's ever written a book, having spent 7 years trying to write mine.
I love that. And I want to come on to sort of how you kept that passion, but where did the healer come into this? Because again, I know a little bit about your journey, but actually if you're happy to talk about what led you to see a healer and what made you select, I guess, that type of person to talk to? Because again, consultants as a group, and again, I mainly know the UK market here, are quite cynical people, like facts and figures and data, and the sort of spiritual aspect can sometimes be downplayed in that. Sort of what led you to feeling you needed to see a healer, and what led you to a healer as opposed to, I don't know, a personal trainer?
Yeah, good question. And today I'd use the term synchronicity. Back then I didn't know what synchronicity meant. But what happened was I was at a cocktail party. It happened to be New Year's Eve, symbolically, the end of one year, the beginning of another year, and actually met an English couple who lived in Glastonbury, England. And many of you, particularly this is more of an English audience, I've certainly heard of the Glastonbury Music Festival, but also many of you may know that Glastonbury has a very rich history of spiritual movements even to this day. And they lived there, and they were talking about, the fact that there were all sorts of people, Buddhists and neo-pagans and witches and fairies and all this sort of thing, which of course to me as a type A management consultant at Accenture all sounded like ridiculously crazy. And then the wife mentioned to me that she did work with a soul reader, and that she and her friends and other people that she's introduced her to have had these very positive experiences. And so I tucked that away. Didn't even occur to me that I would do something like that. However, I went over to Barcelona at the Mobile World Congress, which I would do every year. And I thought, maybe I'll stop by Glastonbury on the way home just to check it out. And I did. And I went to the top of a little hill called Tour, which is very famous in Arthurian lore and so forth. And what came to me was that I needed to have a soul reading with this soul reader. And then next time I was in Europe, I went to Glastonbury. I'd set up an appointment, and not knowing this person and never even speaking to her, went into her house, and she would do a reading kind of looking at my different chakras. And that was the other thing, Nick. She was saying, I'm looking at your root chakra. To give you an idea how naive I was, I didn't even know what a chakra was. So she said, now I'm looking at your whatever chakra, and I'm thinking, what are you even talking about? Nonetheless, she records the reading, and you then listen to it over and over again, and it just had this enormous effect on me. And my life began to change, and events began to occur that were actually seen in the reading, but you don't really understand them until they happen. And, what's happened since then, I mean, I know it sounds really weird, and believe me, I think most people who know me professionally in consulting think I'm a very normal person. But when I would tell people this story, or I would share with them parts of the manuscript of the book I started writing, and then, of course, when the book came out, Journey, other people started reaching out to the soul reader. Some very famous people, very famous business people, and having different, similar experiences. So one of the, and I'll stop on the book, but one of the most gratifying things about the book, other than the fact that I managed to write it, is once in a while I'll get a LinkedIn message from someone I've never heard of. And they would say, Andy, I read your book, and I reached out to the soul reader who identified in the acknowledgments, and I've had a soul reading, and it's changing my life. And thank you. And that just makes me feel so grateful. And of course, the soul reader won't tell me if anyone reaches out. She's very professional and respects people's privacy. And, I find, sometimes I mention this to people and business people, and I think they get a little uncomfortable. But I've gotten very brave. I mean, obviously, I came out with the book. And what I also find, however, is that business people are seekers as well and want to explore. And particularly, I think, newer generations of business people, it's very important to them what's going on in their personal life as much as it is, business. So particularly you're out in Silicon Valley or New York, it's not crazy. I mean, people don't go like, oh my God, you're nuts. They go, can I have the email, the soul reader type of thing.
Wow. No, I think that's brilliant, Andy. And I also think really powerful, given what you said around your personality type and kind of, I guess, who you were as a person. And like you said, kind of you were that consultant who was fairly dismissive of this prior to doing it and the benefits you've seen. And like you say, I mean, it's amazing to hear the impact it's had for others. You mentioned it there around kind of people who are coming into the business world now or younger leaders, but maybe to close this sort of that section off, I'd love to get your take. If someone listening to this, is kind of proverbially rolling their eyes and thinking, why would I get a soul reading? In fact, I'm not, I'll take the name afterwards because I'm not a million miles from Glastonbury here in the UK. But what would you say to them? If I'm sure people have come to you and gone, Andy, why, this all sounds like a bit of nonsense. What would you say to them to make them think, well, maybe actually this could help you?
One thing I've learned over the years, because it's been about 10 years since I had the experience, and it's been 3 years since the book came out. And what I've learned is people need to be drawn to having the experience, not convinced to have it. Because if you're not ready for it, then it's not going to work for you. So I think if it's not so much believing in the hocus pocus part of it, because there's nothing really hocus pocus about it. I mean, that it's a recording and nothing, it's not like there's, smoke and mirrors and all kinds of weird things. I think it's more an issue of, do you have a feeling of inadequacy? Do you have a feeling of having lost touch with yourself? Do you know who you are? And I really look back to who you are is really someone, say, that at the age of, 15, 16, 17-year-old person. That's kind of the purest version of who you are. And one of the things, and then I'll get off of this, but one of the things which is in the novel, which actually happened to me, is that in the reading, I was pointed to a dusty box in the attic of my parents' house. And in that attic and in that box was a sealed letter, nothing on the outside, which turned out to be a letter I wrote to myself when I was 17 years old. And it was a 3-page handwritten letter, and it had a series of questions, and obviously intended from myself to my older self. Those questions and the tone and the voice of that letter absolutely connected me to who I was and how far I had diverged from that. And so I think if you have that sense, then, you would benefit from this sort of journey. And by the way, I think particularly if you're in business, the consulting industry, the travel, the intensity of it, the demanding clients, the moving up or out, kind of moving up the ladder, sort of all those energies can definitely be energies that move you away from yourself and trying to become someone else. And you don't have to do that. You can be yourself and be successful. That's good news. So I think it's that longing for, I just feel something's missing. I'm not sure who I am is kind of a clue that this might be something beneficial.
Amazing. Well, and I think really great advice and also something people can take away, that you can be yourself. And I think in a nice way, the world has become much better in that respect of you can bring your true self and who you are as a person to what you do. And I love, by the way, the letter as well. And I'm going to stop myself asking more about it because I think we could go on for 2 hours about this journey because it's fascinating. But I almost, to bring us back to the sort of consulting side, and it may be, to your point around the timeline, these things are intertwined. But something that I found interesting when we were sort of catching up ahead of this, you mentioned that actually one of the things that let you have the time for the book was the journey you went on with Frog and the time you had out sort of following your first stint there as the CEO. I guess for our listeners, could you maybe bit to take us back to go forward, but could you sort of talk about actually the whole journey with Frog and sort of how that came about? And then, we can dive into the different elements, but just to set the scene, particularly like you said, for maybe our UK listeners, if they've not come across the firm before, who are they? Why did you join? And take us on that journey.
Sure. So Frog Design, is probably one of the two well-known iconic design firms, IDEO being the other one that we're constantly compared to and frankly compete with, a very fine firm. And probably a 50-year-old firm, which is very unusual for a design firm, founded by a fellow Hartmut Essinger, who arguably is probably one of the greatest designers in history. And he worked with Steve Jobs and designed the Macintosh, the Snow White design language, and so forth. But also SAP 3, the Disney cruise ship, the reimagining of Disney World. I mean, these are all massive projects Frog's done. And so within the design industry, we're quite well known. Everybody wants to work there coming out of school and so forth. So I was very blessed to be asked to run Frog, not being a designer myself. because it was experiencing financial difficulty. It was owned by a larger company owned by KKR and losing money. And I was brought in to try to fix it, which I was able to do, despite the fact there's a fair amount of resistance to my coming on board, because I was viewed as someone coming from Accenture, having no design background, and a bit of a slash and burn. I was referred to in some of the early emails, Darth Vader has arrived. So as it turns, which, really makes you feel good. And then the other thing is creative people can be somewhat passive aggressive on a good day. So there was just a lot of energy and emotion and all that. The long story short, managed to turn the company around. We started making money, being profitable. Obviously morale kind of picked up. And at that point, I had recommended that we try to sell Frog. I can talk about this now because it's old news. And I was trying to sell it to Accenture, which I thought would be a great home for it. And what happened was we wanted too much money for the company. And it led to an argument that I had with my superior in the holding company. And it led to a parting of the ways. So Frog was not sold, and I was in a very nice way fired, so to speak. Now, this was very upsetting to me because I'm thinking I did a really great job. Frog's doing really well. This is my dream job. And why would I ever be fired from this? And so it was tough to take. So what happened, however, is now I had some time and I could use that time to finish my novel. And actually, I did some consulting. It's kind of complicated, but basically I spent a fair amount of time finishing the novel. And then, lo and behold, I get a call from the CEO of the company that had bought Frog since then. And he asked me, would you come back and run it again? Because Frog was losing money and in trouble again. So I kind of have this, and this is where you learn to trust the universe and its wisdom in what appeared to be this sort of horrible, unfair thing that happened to me. What actually happened was I was given the opportunity to finish my book, and then I was given the job that I love beyond any job I've ever had, and I could turn the company around for a second time. So, what I've learned, I no longer question why things happened. I find, let it be wind behind your back. Don't be facing the wind and try to battle with it. But that was my story of Frog. 7 years, ran it twice, turned it around twice, and in the middle of it, wrote a book called Journey. So, and I love Frog to this day. I mean, obviously a huge set of friends and hugely admired the company.
Gosh, that is quite a ride. I will ask about the 2 stints there. And you mentioned Steve Jobs, and it does feel a little bit like, Steve Jobs and how things went with him at Apple. Just on the book, because you touched there about trusting the universe, Andy. And again, thinking of listeners who want to take time to follow their passions. Maybe it's a book, maybe it's art, maybe it's traveling the world. The question, I think, and maybe just you can describe how you sort of approach this, is when you leave a job or you sort of finish, and particularly if it's not on your terms, sometimes there can be a desire to quickly get back in. You get all those anxieties of what are others saying? What's the judgment? Is it me? I need to go and prove myself. And I think something obviously that you did very differently is you went, no, I'm going to, to your point, trust the universe. I'm going to do my book. And actually, I'd love to know what gave you that confidence. Was it, to your point, the sort of, the spiritual journey you'd been on? Was it some advice you'd been given by someone? What led you to say, actually, no, I'm going to take this time, as opposed to, pick up your phone, call all your contacts and sort of be in a new role in 1 to 6 months' time?
I think it's about listening. What I think people don't want to sound crazy or schizophrenic or whatever, but I think what we don't realize is we listen to a number of voices inside of ourselves. There's not just one voice. In some cases, medically, that's called schizophrenia or whatever, but even just as a normal person. And you always have to be careful about which voice you listen to. So, I mean, I'll take myself as an example. I have the voice of the 17-year-old that wrote the letter. And then I have the voice of someone who has been hired and fired and promoted and moved over to Accenture, then moved over to Frog, that person. And that person is kind of a gamesman, playing a game kind of in a pinball machine is one of the metaphors I used in the novel. And he's always looking up and seeing what the score is. Now, to me, that's one of the fun things about business is that you can keep score. But the thing that you have to be careful about from a spiritual and self-love point of view is that score is not your score. I mean, your score is inside of you, not on a screen somewhere. And so I feel like I just felt more confident about, not taking what happened personally, thinking it happens for a reason, embracing what it enabled, which was time to write a book, and trusting the universe, and in listening to the small Andy, this inner Andy, listening to the excitement of that Andy, that we can actually write this book and express it and take it out to the world. And much less of, is someone going to think, well, Andy failed and he was fired and he's kind of like at the end of his rope and, damaged goods or, whatever that could be. Now I have a reasonably high level of confidence too, but I just think you just have to be careful. You're not just caught up in the protagonist in the novel, not to give it away, but basically that's his problem. He's playing a game, and human. You're not a character in a game. You're a human being. So in listening to that voice, that inner voice, and once again, I don't want to turn your business thing into like in La La Land, but I just have to tell you, I do believe this. I experienced this. It's life changing.
So firstly, Andy, I'm massively with you, and I'm very happy to talk about these things because I do think in our world, while it's moving that way, it's not talked about enough. And to your point, there's things even 5 years ago, 10 years ago that were considered woo-woo that's now normal. Things like, if you look at meditation, meditation, gosh, I don't even know how much the industry's worth, but everyone meditates now. And you think 10, 20 years ago, actually, was that something anyone did, or the people who did were called crazy? So I'm very much with you on that. And I love your pinball analogy, because I think, and I've been guilty of this in the past as well, it can be very easy to keep score. And I think things like LinkedIn make it a lot easier to keep score, because you can see your progression, your grade, your client. It becomes very easy to see that. But like you say, actually that inner focus is really important. I didn't ask, but I'm going to, because you've now said it again. What did 17-year-old Andy say to you that had such a profound effect?
Oh, some of the questions were sort of what you expect, like, are you married? Do you have children? Basic things, so predictive. But the ones that were really haunting were ones around the fact that Andy said, I always find it a little hard to figure out how to fit in, but I worry when I do fit in, I'm not who I really am. Do you still have that feeling? And there were a couple like that, which really were capturing this idea of, it's almost like you feel dragged away from your true self because of everything around you. And of course, as a 17-year-old, that's called peer groups and that sort of thing. But look, as a 50-year-old, you still have peer groups. You're a 17-year-old with older clothing. So it was that part, that haunting sort of warning coming from this young, barely in the world person who already sensed this tension in life and asking me, how was I dealing with it? And of course, the answer at the time, and honestly, it was a very emotional experience. I cried, as I'm reading this. And he was sort of asking, well, how are you doing with this? And the answer, of course, that was shortly after the reading, was, well, not very well, actually. Not very well at all. I would say now I can answer younger Andy and say, actually, I'm doing well, but I got to be careful because I can, it's a slippery slope going back to old habits. But that part of the letter was just very haunting to me. And, just he laid out, here's a 17-year-old kid laying out what his 50-year-old equivalent was going to be dealing with. And now, can I mention one other thing? And then we can talk about whatever you want. But one point I would make with people who are still haven't dropped off, thinking they were on a podcast with a nut job. I'm going to take it even further. I believe getting yourself into that state of mind of trusting the universe and being human is actually a superpower in business. And I'll give you one example. I'll try to keep it quick. A very close friend of mine, was having difficulty with her boss. And she was having calls where she was trying to get things done and would always end up angry and hostile and inconclusive. And so in talking to me about this, she was very frustrated. What do I do? And I said to her, I think you need to love her, and it was like, what? I said, you need to love your boss. And of course, she's looking at me like, and this is in a very, very large, hardcore company, right? And at very high level. Both of these people are near, one click below the CEO of the company. And I said, here's what's happening. You frighten her. you are a relatively attractive woman and very smart and this, that, and the other thing. So what happens, you get on the call, you scare her. And when fear kicks in, of course, the reptilian part of the mind kicks in. And when that happens, the person no longer hears what you're saying. I mean, this is like biochemically true, right? And I said, that's what's happening. You're stimulating her reptilian brain, and she doesn't hear a word you're saying. You're not having a conversation. You're just like, at an impasse. So I said, next time you're going to have a call with her on video, I want you to spend 5 minutes beforehand, close your eyes and think about her. Think about her as a mother. Think about her as a daughter, as a wife. Think about what she did that morning getting ready for work. Think about what she had to eat, just all that with your eyes closed. And then when you're ready, hit join and talk to her, but love her. And I guess she did it. And afterwards, she called me and said, oh my God, Andy, we just had the most productive call I've ever had with her. And we really got into things and made some decisions. So fast forward 3 months later, this person calls my friend, and my friend was up for promotion, a big promotion. And she calls her to tell her she's promoted. And then she says, Susie, that's not her name. I have to say, about 3 months ago, I don't know what happened, but I just felt we started communicating much better. And right now, I have to tell you, I communicate better with you than anyone else in the company. And I just want to thank you for that. So, it's a superpower.
I think, Andy, I fully agree with you. And I think there's so much, what I find amazing, so with the things you're saying as well, is actually how a lot of this has existed for years, but hasn't had whether it's awareness, whether it's the prevalence that it should do. So a couple of things to your point on those sort of inner voices. I think there's a very old book, The Magic of Thinking Big. I don't know if you've read that, by David Schwartz. I mean, we're going back, I reread it time by time, and it always makes me smile because it talks about the fact some intrepid explorers are digging the tunnel between England and France, which was, the Eurotunnel was built about 50, 60 years ago, but it shows you the kind of how thoughts become things. And I do think, that talks about what you say and to yourself having a huge impact. The other one is, and, I'm with you on this. I'm a big Tony Robbins fan. And again, I might be alienating listeners with this, but I think a lot of, what you've said there around visualization and actually kind of, if you aim for it, you get it. We've all heard about the BMW sort of, you want a BMW, you see a BMW. And I think the example you've just given there, I think brings it home more so because of and we'll talk about your sort of Accenture career momentarily, but shows that this works just as well at the senior levels of consulting firms as it does in kind of, to your point, the kind of spiritual world of Glastonbury. So no, Andy, I think it's a brilliant example. I'm sure more will come out. So I'm not going to ask for any more at the moment, but I'm sure as we go through, more will come. And maybe actually, to the point you mentioned around your journey with Frog, you were sort of trusting the universe. You wrote the book. You got this call from the new owner. It may just be that the ownership changed, and that made it an obvious decision. But did you have any trepidation about going back? And almost what did you ask yourself? Was it a no-brainer, or were there some questions, concerns you asked yourself before saying, "Yeah, I'm jumping back into this"?
Yeah, I think very good question, Nick. And what I'd say, it was a relatively easy decision, and here's why. One is that I really loved Frog. That hadn't changed by leaving. Secondly, there were some things that I felt I wanted to get done at Frog. And of course, I ran out of time first time. The third thing is that I had a different owner and a different CEO who, although I didn't know him that well, I just felt, just based on one meeting, if you will, that we could have a better relationship. And then finally, to be honest with you, a number of Frogs who got wind of the fact that I may come back were very, very energetically, like, please come back. So I knew I would be welcomed back. And so that all drove me. It just seemed like the perfect decision and opportunity. And sure enough, when I did come back, instead of the first time when everyone referred to me as Darth Vader has arrived, the second time I came back, everyone kind of thought, okay, Andy's come back to save us. And what I would say to people, because I go to these town halls and I would refer to what it was like the first time I joined Frog to run it versus this time. And I said, in some ways, I prefer the first time where the expectations were so low that I could exceed them. Now I'm coming back and Frog was losing money again and all that. And, the expectation is, well, now everything's going to be fine. And of course, no, not necessarily. I mean, I'm not a magician. I mean, it's, and so it was kind of funny the second time. It was so wonderful. You almost were afraid of expectations being too high. But it was a very easy decision for me. Frog just is, this magical place, and the work is great, and the people are amazing. So it was great to go back.
And you might not be able to talk about this, so stop me if you can't. But you mentioned you joined twice, you turned the business round twice, and obviously, Frog's a substantial business. To your point, really strong reputation. It's a very big question, but if you could summarize kind of what were the key levers you pulled to turn that business round, and were they the same levers twice, or was it different levers when you were Darth Vader versus, I don't know if there was a Star Wars analogy used, were you Obi-Wan, were you Luke? I don't know what they called you, or was it the Star Wars references died after the first time?
Yeah, no, I mean, it was both times there was a little bit of house cleaning in terms of maybe there was a little too much tolerance for low performers around the edges. And so, that was kind of easy if it's a low performer, particularly if they're expensive. We really can't afford to have that. So that was part of it. I think the other thing is just understanding the dynamic in a creative agency consulting environment and people joke that, you don't want a creative running a creative agency. The fact is that you can't just be as a general manager. The criteria can't be how much people like you. It's got to be, how are the results doing? Because if you really care about the people and want to protect them, you need to financially perform. And so don't get confused between being popular and being caring about your people. And particularly when you're in a sophisticated set of creatives that can be highly manipulative, whether it's consumers or their boss, you just can't fall for that. And so you need to be liked, but not pandered to being liked. And I think that's sort of something that's a little tough to handle. And then, of course, there's always luck. I mean, the market changing. We did launch something, Frog Ventures, which allowed us to start working with smaller companies. That was hugely successful. And that was something I wanted to do the first time, but I never got to it in time. So that was kind of a strategic business model change. We opened up, we went to nearshore studios in India and Mexico City, which we hadn't done before. That was a huge plus. So, it's kind of Harvard Business School sort of thing, some of it. And then some of it is this sort of softer, knowing how to work with creatives in a way that's very productive for them and for investors.
Yeah, that's a really useful overview, Andy. And I think your point around you can love your people without being popular and is a really important one, particularly as we over here, but I think it's the same in the US, we're moving towards a recession. And with all of the focus on well-being and looking after your team, which is critical, sometimes you can lose sight of, well, you still need to make money. And if you don't, there is no team. And sadly, we've seen some of that in the tech world with businesses that were big, had a lot of funding, but that dried up. And I think is a really important point, like you say, of if there's no money coming in, you might have no business for people to love. So getting that right is the first, is most important. Interesting what you said about Frog Ventures. And I think might be a nice segue to, I know we're jumping around the chronology a bit, but you obviously spent a lot of time at Accenture. And, this brings to life, I think, some of the things we talked about earlier of actually the mindset, the way you approach business and life. It works in big, very high growth organizations, very focused, high performing ones. And actually, you were involved at the start of what was Accenture Interactive, which again, I know has become a huge part of Accenture's business now, but wasn't when it was, you plus a few people. This is as much for my own interest as our listeners, Andy, but I'd love to know the origin story of Accenture Interactive and how that came to being.
Well, yeah, it really is kind of interesting. A number of things I don't think people realize about it. One was that the seed was planted for Accenture Interactive over 15 years ago. And so, one truth is things take a lot longer than you think. And people lose track of that. Like they say, okay, Facebook goes public. Yeah, but Facebook, went public after, 10 years or 15 years or whatever. You don't know how long things take. So the brilliant thing that Accenture did, and I should give a bunch of people credit, but let's say Bill Green, who was CEO of Accenture at that time and was involved in recruiting me into Accenture at a fairly senior level. He and the team decided to create something called Accenture New Businesses. Probably today we'd call it an incubator. But basically the idea was we wanted to create new businesses that use different business models from consulting and outsourcing, but were adjacent to what Accenture did. And I was asked to run this because of my background at Idea Lab, the incubator. And as Bill said, because I was running I was running the comms industry globally for Accenture, and that was a $3 billion business. And now I'm running new businesses, which basically is zero. And I'm sort of, Bill, I kind of would rather run a big business. And he said, well, you're one of the few people we have that's worked with small businesses and startups and venture. So we need you here. So I decided I would do it. Well, you didn't have any choice, right? It's Accenture. But involved with me was Tim Breen, who at that time was running corporate strategy for Accenture. Jeffrey Merrihew, who has a heavy marketing background, and eventually Mike Sutcliffe. When I say co-founded, that's why I'm saying there's a number of people involved. So the remit was so broad. We had money for organic build of technology platforms, and then we had M&A money. And Accenture Interactive started out around the idea of optimizing websites. So, the internet was clearly there. This is around 2009. But, companies are building websites, but, how do you optimize them both from, impressions and commerce point of view? And so we started buying analytic engines that you then can put on top of websites and kind of help, on the fly design them better, find lost links, stuff like that. Tiny companies, but the business model was, you pay a monthly subscription fee or per user. It wasn't consulting. It wasn't outsourcing. But these were tiny companies. While I was there, we bought 7 of them and kind of knitted them together. So we kind of had this engine that could analyze website performance and do a little bit of designing. And then that's why it was called Accenture Interactive, because it was really looking at websites. Well, then what happened after I left and tried to sell Frog to Accenture, they ended up buying Fjord instead, which is a very respectable design firm, and started moving up the chain in terms of now designing websites, not just optimizing them, but designing websites and designing digital product. Then ultimately they bought Droga, moving into the traditional media agency business. They bought a ton of design firms. But the initial sort of germ of an idea with Accenture Interactive was website optimization, which is why it was called Accenture Interactive, which last year, David Droga changed the name to Accenture Song, because interactive sounds a little dated. And it is dated because that was how we started in 2009. And now it's this multi-billion-dollar business. But I give credit to Accenture. Obviously, I was there 10 years. I still have a fair amount of Accenture stock. I do believe it's one of the best managed companies in the world, not just in consulting. But I give them a lot of credit for creating this new businesses and really walling it off from the rest of the firm, making some serious investments at that time, and just building businesses from scratch. I mean, they just did a really good job, because out of that, you got Accenture Interactive and you got Accenture Mobility, which became ultimately Industry X. And these are platform businesses that, you get revenue while you sleep. And it's still a relatively small part of Accenture, but a growing part. And that's sort of where Accenture Interactive came from.
Wow. It's and I think your point around the origin and the length of time some of these things takes really interesting, because you sometimes you do forget it's not, it takes 10 years to be an overnight success, but to be on the ground floor and sort of the starting point of that must have been amazing. And I'd be fascinated, Andy, how was that shift for you and for the leadership team? You mentioned obviously you were running the global comms business. You'd spent, the best part of your career running big consulting businesses, PwC before and Accenture. And suddenly you're into a team where you are zero revenue. I'm sure you had people, but it was nowhere near as big. It was, I assume, much more hands-on. How was that actually for you and the team? And how, if at all, did you have to adapt from going from, that 3 billion business to ground zero in that starting point?
Well, I think, to tell you the truth, I don't think I would have been successful at it if I hadn't had the experience with Bill Gross at Idea Lab during the .com period. So at Idea Lab, our idea of a company was a graphics designer and 2 of us with an idea. And that's all you had, right? I'll give you an example. I don't know people who don't know Bill Gross. There's 2 Bill Grosses. One is a very famous bond trader, and then Bill Gross, the entrepreneur who started up 110 companies, 15 in public. I mean, eToys and Net Zero and GoTo.com and so forth. So I'm talking about the incubator entrepreneur. So here's the way things work there. We're sitting around the room. We're saying, we're selling books, we're selling music, we're selling toys, and the question comes up, can we sell cars online? Okay. And everyone's looking at each other and said, no, nobody's ever going to buy a car. It's $50,000. No one's ever going to buy a car on a website. Okay. So Bill, being Bill, says, well, I don't know. Let's see. And he draws a few screens, gives it to a graphics guy, tells him to go next door to the bookstore, get a Kelly Blue Book. And I think they're in UK as well. These are the books that have all the prices of cars and stuff.
Yeah.
And he says, could you put up a couple screens, buy the car search terms from goto.com, which was preceded Google. Google didn't exist yet. And buy car search terms and set this thing up and run it tonight, which he does. So next morning we come in and we're talking about this stuff, and someone says, hey, by the way, whatever happened with that car site? And Bill goes, yeah, I don't know. And then we go over and the poor graphics guy is fast asleep at his desk, right? So Bill wakes him up and says, hey, what happened? Did you get the site up? Did anything happen? And the kid wakes up, he smiles, says, yeah, he said, we sold 3 cars. So, and Bill's like, shut it down, right? So that's another way of how you build a business, right? Is just that you don't argue and you don't hire McKinsey to do a study on whether or not people are going to buy cars on the internet. You put up a site and you sell 3 cars. And that became ultimately Cars Direct, which was, a very early successful car commerce site. So learning to think that in that way, in terms of building businesses, was what I could bring to bear when I got to Accenture. That if I had not had that experience, I think it would be more like a classic big time consultant saying, well, how can I do this? I need 100 people and, all that sort of thing.
I love that example, Andy. And I think so, true then and even truer today, there's so many tools where actually you or I could go and do that, landing page and build those. But I think your point is really powerful of test with the consumer and see what happens. There's an interesting question in that, though. And you mentioned that Accenture had walled off new biz. So the answer to this may be obvious, but you got that. To your point of if you're a consultant, you'd been 40 years in your career, you were used to hundreds of people making decks before you did anything, you would be quite nervous of that approach. How did you get, I guess, your superiors or your sort of peers in Accenture comfortable with you doing that? Or I guess to your point, did you not because it was walled off? How did you approach that?
Well, I mean, I think the nice thing, Accenture's sort of management system sometimes can be a little claustrophobic in the sense of it being so big and so process driven. You can kind of feel like you're in a big machine. On the other hand, it does work. And so basically, it was a very strategic decision. There was a group of about 40 people to put together a strategy for a 5-year strategy. And one of the elements of that was to create this new business function. And then in looking at, how would we run it? The conclusion was looking at best practice, so forth, that, wall it off, don't try to integrate, experiment, and so forth and so on. And, here's some resources you might need just to kind of, so it wasn't like one person. And then I think Bill, just was relatively smart to say, gee, actually, I don't think I'll take the partner that's running the Exxon account where we're doing $500 million worth of outsourcing and say, hey, could you start up new businesses? I think he meant it when he said, you've done that. And most of the senior leadership of Accenture has been Accenture their whole life and operated at that scale. And so I think it was a good idea to put me into that job and get it off the ground. I mean, Mike Sutcliffe, who had his whole career was at Accenture, and he ultimately became the head of Accenture Digital, which was a combination of Accenture Mobility and Interactive. He's a very large client, running big P&Ls. And to his credit, he played the role after I left. He took them together as Accenture Digital, and he scaled the business. He took a business that probably at that point was doing a few $100 million in revenue and took it up to, wherever it is now, $4 or $5 billion. So I thought they were really good about, who runs it when, what are the rules of engagement. It's a real success story.
It's really interesting to hear. And I think particularly for anyone listening who is in a larger firm like Accenture, your point of actually the benefits of walling off, if you're doing one of those new business ventures or just something you want to incubate, actually not trying to suffocate it too early or integrate it too early, give it that room to breathe, test. And you mentioned there around the scale, because I think in our conversation, we've talked a little bit about, your time with Bill and doing the quick website. We've talked about, you bought some little platforms, but it's probably worth sharing with our listeners, you scaled that business to a very significant business. And I'd be interested, how you did that. Where we talked about you bought these 7 platforms. Was it then just that you integrated those, sold those to sort of current clients? What was it, something else? And you mentioned around the split in sort of what was new business, and then you led mobility after that. Kind of actually, how much did that have an impact on the growth journey and where you took that business unit?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we took advantage of in the scaling part of it is in the case of Accenture, and I think there are obviously other firms that can say the same thing about, Accenture's very client-centric firm and has very deep, close relationships with clients. The account partners just are dedicated to their clients' success. And so if I have a new widget and I have a business proposition for that widget, the account partners are very happy to take them to the client. It will be very qualified. You'll end up in a meeting with the right people. I mean, this is something that as a small company, you just wouldn't have. And so when these analytic engines and so forth, we're ready to go out to test or to implement, there's a lot of very excited partners who want to introduce you to. And that's one of the issues of protection, because otherwise you get swamped. And then you sell one to, I think one of our, now this is really going back in time, but one of our original sales was to Procter & Gamble, which obviously is a huge, account to sell a web optimization tool into, right? And it's a tool, but obviously there's a lot of IT consulting around the implementation and so forth. So, the tool in some ways is probably the least attractive thing from Accenture's point of view, because you're selling in a lot of consulting services as well, or outsourcing services. But, you get the meeting. Now you have Procter & Gamble as a client. Okay, that makes it easier for other clients you go to. So from a sales and business development point of view, we tended to scale using the Accenture because it is so powerful, right? That channel. But from the creation of the tool and the product management and marketing of the tool, that's what we kind of kept pretty walled off. And the reason for that, one of the reasons is, just in general in the consulting industry is notorious for not being able to do product. And the reason for that is because they customize everything. Client says, well, can I have it white instead of black? Consultants' DNA is, yes, I can make it black, And of course, if you're trying to do a platform or a product, what you have to learn to do, like if you're Oracle or SAP, you say, no, it doesn't do that, or it will do that the next generation. And so part of the walling off was on the product side, on the M&A side, on the product strategy side. We controlled that, but we leveraged the Accenture distribution and account relationships. So that was one of the key things to the success of it.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And it raises an interesting question, actually, Andy. And one, just because I know a number of people who are in firms like Accenture and their peers and businesses that are acquired into those firms as well, because they've got a product offering, they might have an analytics engine, let's say. And I'm interested because, to your point, on one side, having that sales network is a really powerful tool. You take your product and Accenture can sort of fire it out to thousands of clients through those partners. I guess for some people, there's probably a question that says, well, in our case, actually, how do we get traction with those people? Because, just like you were going to these partners with your analytics, I suspect, there were 40, I think you said 40 other sort of elements of this strategy, 40 other people doing the same. Now, it might have been you were coming in from a very senior level, so, there was a hierarchy. But actually, for anyone who maybe has one of these offerings in their firm, actually, how can they get cut through with the right partners and I guess not get lost in the noise of everyone else?
Well, one is when I was doing new business at Accenture, I think we were at about 230,000 people. I haven't looked recently. I think it's 760,000 or 780,000. I think Accenture acquires, at least I track the stock in the news because I am a shareholder. They seem to acquire a new company about every 3 to 4 days. Now I don't know how big they are, but some I think are bigger than anything I acquired. Some I'm sure are very small. So it's a very different world today at Accenture. And I think a number of these firms, the scale is much higher and the number of new things being brought into the business is much higher. So I don't have a good answer for you because I don't work at any of them anymore. I can imagine that one is having had one experience with a company I was associated with being bought by Accenture recently. I know that they really are very, they have a sort of cookie cutter approach, and I don't mean that in a bad way, of, how they're brought in, how long they stay independent, which elements are integrated first, and so forth. So I do think, after they've acquired, I don't know, maybe hundreds and hundreds of companies now, that they kind of are very sensitive of what works and doesn't work. But yeah, I would think as an account partner now at Accenture, and it's been 15 years since I've been there, or no, maybe 10 years. You've got to have like just this incredible potpourri of things you can take to a client. So how do you decide what you want to bring to a client, and how do I, as a new company, get any attention? I think that's a very, account planning, internal marketplace sort of thing. I'm sure some of the ways they're dealing with it, but
probably, yeah, the scale of growth and, like you say, the scale of opportunity has increased a lot since, like you say, you were there. And maybe next guest, Andy, I'll have to get someone who's currently at one of your former colleagues who's currently at Accenture. We can ask them. They will tell us about how they do it. I guess probably one, but maybe two last questions on your Accenture time, because to your point, I'm conscious it was a little while ago. But, again, thinking today for anyone who is doing this themselves, you mentioned, we've talked a lot about the successes of what was New Biz and Mobility and became Song. I'm sure there were some challenging times and some tough times. And again, thinking more about today's world and probably the journey you've been on, kind of what were some of those challenges? And actually, if anyone is launching a new business like you did today in a firm like Accenture, what would you almost tell them to do differently, or, things that they can do to accelerate that process or not go down some of those dead ends or pitfalls that, may have been learnings for yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, let me, if I can be allowed, if I take it up a level from just Accenture, and let's call them large management consulting IT services firms, because I don't want to sound too specific. I think that if I were being asked to start up a new entity within the company, or I'm being bought by one of these entities, what I'd really want to probe is, do they understand the importance of the soft part of this? So when they're acquiring you or something, business plans, numbers, and all that, of course, they due diligence, that they all do that roughly the same. But from a soft point of view, how many degrees of freedom do they have within their infrastructure, whether it's HR, finance, whatever it is, such that you have enough degrees of freedom that these different kinds of entities can sit under the same umbrella? And some companies are kind of one size fits all. Other companies are like holding companies, and then there's something in between. Holding companies, okay, I mean, it just means that it's more of a financial transaction and you continue to run your own company. One size fits all, I would be very concerned about that, because it doesn't. So when looking at any of these companies, whether it's Accenture or Wipro or McKinsey or whatever, I would just say, have they reflected in their infrastructure and processes the sort of potential diversity that needs to be addressed? Because, if you're a media agency, is very different than a cybersecurity entity, which is very different from a strategy consulting group. Can they articulate how they have these cohabit and also work together? And I think it's the holy grail, right? I mean, it's the, as you scale, that's what you have to do. And I think some firms do it better than others. And I'm not really, to be honest, I'm just not up to date on, every one of them and how they're doing. But I think that's the critical thing. If I were to try to be an incubator inside one of them, or is looking at being acquired by one of them.
I think a great point. And again, to things that can sometimes get lost in our industry, like you say, that softer side. And, we touched on some of that from a personal perspective earlier, but actually as a culture, as a firm, like you say, firms can be very different. Design creatives versus management consultants culturally don't always get on. And like you say, thinking about that's really important. I'm mindful of what you said around sort of actually the time that has elapsed. And I'd be keen to bring us up to date. And we've used the word journey a lot. We've talked about your book journey. I've talked about your personal journey. Now keen to talk about your business journey, Andy, because I think not only are you doing some fascinating work in an area that I've not spoken to anyone else on in the podcast, but I think it's going to be really interesting for the world over the next 10 years or however long. But I'd love to sort of bring to life, I guess, what you are doing now. And maybe before we dive into some of the sort of what and the detail, maybe if you could give an overview of actually sort of how Journey came to be and why you launched the firm and what you set out to do.
Sure. Well, a little bit of the background is that around this time last year, early fall of last year, because I'd been part of an acquisition, Frog was part of another acquisition, and we were sort of changing organizations. So I felt it was a good time for me to move on because I had been CEO for 5 to 6 years. I have this theory that you can, as a CEO, because the company Journey is my third CEO job. So it's like if you can contribute for 5 to 6 years. I think it's going to be a little different for a founder, but for a professional manager, 5 or 6 years, they get the best of what you have to give to that company. And then I think it's very healthy. Accenture actually does this reasonably well. They don't mandate it, but it's time to move on. New, fresh blood. And there's all kinds of reasons why this is good versus, say, having, what's his name, run GE for 30 years, right? Not to take a Jack Welch or something. Anyway, so I decided to move on. So I was trying to think, I actually was thinking, do I finish my second and third novel? Do I do some consulting with Frog or just in general? And I was doing a meditation as we were discussing meditation.
We talked about earlier.
And yes, and that meditation led to two things. One was me saying, if I really love Frog, I need to step aside and let fresh blood come in. And I had in mind who that would be. And then this idea for this company came into my head. And I just started frantically writing it down before I forgot it. And that little 3-page Word document became my investor sort of pitch. And in it, I talked about the fact that I wanted to do this company that focuses on the end customer journey and touch points that are going through evolutionary or revolutionary change. And the revolutionary change may be that it's a touch point that didn't exist before, for example. And then for those pieces of the journey and customer journey, I wanted to buy the leading edge agencies in each of those spaces and then go to a client and say, we will help you reimagine and build the next generation of your end customer journey in the areas that are changing the most and are going to be the most important. And I had in mind a few companies that I had relationships with to start, and that's what happened. So I went to very small private equity firms. They liked the idea. I had a number of firms offer, to back me, and that led to me departing Frog at the end of last year, and literally on January 2nd, launching this company, Journey. That name for the company did not come from me, despite the fact that I'd written a novel called Journey. It was actually a fellow, Jim Citrin, who some people may know, very famous headhunter who's kind of been a counselor to me and read my book. And I was calling it Project X, and he's the one who said, I have the perfect name for your company. I said, what? And he said, Journey. So people think that, well, Andy is calling it Journey because of his book. No, it just, the universe contributed that name, or Jim Citrin did anyway. And so we bought a company that does physical design space, but is particularly well known for using technology to reimagine an experience of physical space. Take things like the JetBlue terminal in JFK, which was first to implement iPads as part of the passenger experience, a Sloan Kettering outpatient cancer facility, which used wearables and no check-in, a learning environment in what is a very tough, emotional place to be going to, and so on and so forth. And then we bought a company which is building out applications and experiences in voice, Alexa, Siri, and so forth, which is, a very pervasive technology, not really being exploited that much. It's a $40 billion voice commerce business without even trying. And then we bought a company that specializes in the metaverse. And then we'll be buying, later this fall, we will be announcing a few other acquisitions in related areas. And we're doing some really cool work in all these spaces. And we believe they start coming together because when you think about designing your end customer journey, you need to think about the physical and how that relates to metaverse. A client of ours, but someone who famously did something early on, Nike did a metaverse in Roblox, and then they took a version of that and have it in their destination stores, physical stores. So just the blurring of sort of these worlds are something that we see in the future. So that's the idea of Journey, and working with top brands in the world, having a lot of success, and very exciting.
Well, I think that's fascinating. And I think I really like, Andy, the frame around actually it's, that customer touch points, actually looking holistically, still considering the physical and also the metaverse, because I think, the metaverse gets a lot of press, some good, some bad, but you hear everything from no one's ever going to go to a shop anymore to, actually it's a waste of time. And I'd love, I think, for you to bring it to life for our listeners, because obviously our listeners work with large corporates. In the US, it'd be the Fortune 500. Here, it's the FTSE 100, but large corporate organizations. And I think technologies like voice, technologies like, everything that underpins the metaverse and sort of Web3, people can sometimes think it's a bit far off, but something, and just because I know it's current, and I was just looking at your LinkedIn ahead of today, and I know you launched with Walmart a project that sort of brings this to life. And I'd love if you could just talk a bit more about that, because I think as brands go, and I'm saying this as a Brit, so forgive me if this is incorrect sort of for an American audience, Walmart is seen as very traditional, very good business, but traditional business. They're embracing this. So I'd love to understand more about how you see those channels for businesses like Walmart, and a bit about actually what you did with them.
Sure. Yeah. So, just came out Monday. Very excited. A major project for us and for Walmart, our client. And I can't talk about everything just because, frankly, there are future things, as they've alluded to in their press release, that are planned. But I can talk about some of what's going on. And, basically, I think I can speak on behalf of not just Walmart, but a number of companies feel a little burned in terms of they missed the first round with the web, and then they missed mobile, and they don't want to miss this one. So there's a little bit of that going on just in general. However, the other part of this, though, is very similar to what Web 1.0 is commercialization. It's like, but I don't understand. I can get 100 million people coming to my website, but it costs me $100 million to do that from a customer acquisition point of view. And then I'm not making any money. And that's exactly where it was at Web 1.0. But what I tell people is that it also was the genesis of Google, Amazon, Facebook. I mean, you take the cumulative market cap of what came out of 1.0, it's a scary portion of the total market cap of, the worldwide indexes. Okay. And that's only 20 years ago. So in mobile, obviously, Apple, Samsung, So I think we have to think about this. Is there frothiness? Is there silliness? Is there bad businesses being created in this frothy Web3 metaverse? Absolutely. Absolutely there is. So do I wait until, am I Sears and I wait until the dust settles and I figure out, oh, that's how I make money? And then I go into it? Well, no, because by that time, whatever, the next Amazon will have taken that over. And so I think that's driving some of this. Now, what we did for Walmart specifically is we did help them with their strategy. And that has to do with things like there's a lot of platforms out there, and I don't want to bore the audience, but you have Roblox, you have Decentraland, Sandbox, you have the Meta Horizons from Facebook, you have Apple about to come out with some things. I mean, there's easily a dozen platforms, some of which are AR, VR, some of which are more gaming, that are out there. And so one of the things is, where do you play? The second thing is there's different traditions, AR, VR, highly immersive, high fidelity. And then you have the gaming traditions like Fortnite and Roblox that are gamey, cartoonish, lower res. They have different demographics. They have different levels of audience. So just that alone, sifting through that takes a lot of time. Then you get into strategic intent. What is your intent? What are you trying to do? Are you trying to sell things? Are you trying to do a brand kind of modification? Are you trying to just get impressions? What are you trying to do? And then after that, it's like, okay, let's do this platform because it's these demographics. Now the issue is it's a different world. Your brand has to adapt to the platform, not the other way around, particularly in the more gaming-centric platforms, right? Your brand has to adapt to them. They're not going to adapt to you. And that's a tough one, particularly when you're talking about, mega brands like a Walmart or Nike. I mean, they spent their, a century building this brand and so forth. So basically, at that point, we're saying, okay, now we're going to start designing. So we start designing worlds. In the case of Walmart, we rolled out 2 worlds initially. One is called Walmart Land, which is kind of the core retail spaces in Walmart with some entertainment. It has a disco, it has a movie theater, it has different things like that. And then we have the Walmart Playground, which is sort of what it sounds like. It's a toys. I mean, I'm being very simplistic here. In fact, Walmart would shake them. But I mean, it's basically the toy section of the store. We don't want you to think of it that way. We want you to think of it as, Babes in Toyland experience, not aisles in a store by any means. The whole point of the metaverse is, I mean, you can play with the toys, you can be the toy, and that sort of thing. And then there'll be some other things coming out. They have announced that we'll have a music festival next week with some very, very, top, very hot artists. And you can imagine that there's other things that could be built beyond what we're already building. So that's it came out on Monday. It's gotten very nice critical reviews. Roblox has featured it as the, new world for the week to go to. Very high like ratings. Roblox is a whole rating system. And yes, Nick, when you said about the brand, the look and feel of this is a little different than what you would expect from something like Walmart. And that's very purposeful, because this is a much younger demographic on Roblox, but, you need to have a look and feel that would attract that kind of audience. And so there's also a bit of a brand shift here that you can do in a metaverse that maybe in a more effective way than you do with TV advertising. You know what I mean? So it's pretty fascinating. And just the logistics of this is that you go into, for those of you who've never used Roblox, you go in as a character, you can dress in a campy Walmart vest, so like you're an employee there. You can play games, musical games, different games. You win tokens. With those tokens, you can get merch. So you can go into the Netflix theater, sponsored by Netflix. You can do games and get merch, and you can get intangible Stranger Things t-shirts that you now can wear. That's it's a very robust environment. And, a number of the lead articles said, Walmart obviously is as the largest retailer in the world, has just, put out there the largest metaverse build of any retailer. And so, that's pretty impressive. And we did it. I mean, we did it with the client, obviously, but we did the build and built the world and so forth.
Amazing. Well, congratulations to you and to Walmart. And I'll be honest, I haven't been able to look. I don't have Roblox myself, but having seen the articles, and I understand we see a lot of our younger relatives, and so I'm very familiar with Minecraft and Fortnite. My son is quite young, so I think we'll be on Roblox shortly. But I think a fascinating example of actually bringing the metaverse to life and the impact it has. I really liked what you said of actually, because I think it's quite true. We are at a really almost sort of epochal moment of Web3, like Web2, like Web1. There will be real winners that come out early. And actually, if you can grab that, and you may have answered my next question already, because at Web1, at Web2, these larger corporate organizations were quite slow. They were quite risk averse. To your point, Web3, are you actually finding this is an easy conversation to have because they were burnt twice? They want to try this. You're not finding that resistance, or are you still finding, some of these organizations, they're run by people who have never heard of Roblox. Do you still get some pushback? And if so, sort of how do you sort of challenge the client with that? How do you overcome those, skepticisms?
Yeah, no, I kind of, unscientifically, because obviously I just happen to talk to a set of people, it seems to be about 50-50. About 50-50. And then I'd even break it down more. I'd say 25% of the people are excited about this and think of it as enablement and so forth. And think of it as a future. I think 25% of the people, these are executives, are more in the fear part of it, that I've been burned a couple of times. So I don't know why I'm doing this, but I have to do it because I've been burned before. Then I think there's sort of 25% of the people who are type A rationalists who just don't have it in their heart and soul to ever support something that they can't write out as a business case. And then I think there's 25% of the people who just hate change, whatever it is, even if it's good change, right? So those are sort of the demographics. And, that last 25% are the ones that still think it's silly to order groceries online. But, I will because I don't want to go to the store, type of thing. But so it really is. Now, right now, well, particularly for a company our size, of course, but just in general, just with those stats, I mean, it's a high growth area because you're going from zero to something. So from a business opportunity point of view, it's huge, But I mean, I definitely don't think it's like everybody in the world's pounding the table saying we got to do this. There's a lot of naysayers, and I have a lot of sympathy for that. But I do tell them, look, I mean, you could have said the same thing with 1.0, and like you can't sell cars on a website, but now you can, so you just have to.
Yeah, well, and I think your point there of, actually 50%, and I know it was a crude sort of estimate, but if 50% of people are behind this, there is a huge growth there. And, this is how economies grow, how companies shrink. Some companies will embrace, some won't. And, I think you're right as well. And it'll be really interesting to see the winners, the losers, what lands well, what doesn't, because I think there has been in pockets in sort of less metaverse, more just Web3 in general, sort of some bad press, the kind of the NFT crash that we've seen over the last year, raising questions around actually is that, what does that mean for NFTs as a platform? And I suspect we'll see other platforms, other sort of projects that will go out of popularity, but actually that core technology and so, the underpinnings are going to lead to some winners. And like you say, it sounds like enough people are understanding that to help, for you to take your proposition to and for them to embrace it as well.
Yeah. And I didn't even mention the crypto NFT part of it. Now, there have been crashes, been corrections, and so forth. But once again, I would say that's the healthy creative destruction that goes on. And there were a number of e-commerce sites in 2000, 2001 that went bankrupt, because they spent so much money on customer acquisition and they weren't getting the related commerce pull through. So, hundreds of millions of dollars lost, but you also had Amazon. So that's the thing. And Amazon was losing a lot of money, right?
Yeah.
At that time. So it's hard. I mean, I think, it's hard and it's fun, but, I'm just firmly convinced it's the future, but that's the easy part. How do you make money at it and how quickly things happen? That's the art part of it, so.
When I think your example from Web 1 is it pets.com's the famous example of, I was a bit younger then, but pets.com was one of the famous, got a lot of money, never made money, went to zero. It's kind of I don't even say the poster child of the .com boom from memory, but I think you may be able to tell me better. But
unfortunately, one of ours at Idealab, eToys, which was one of the first e-commerce sites and one of the first to go public, actually did go bankrupt pretty quickly on. But it was a situation of spending way too much on traditional advertising and customer acquisition. So it was really kind of an operational business problem. Not that toys aren't going to be sold on the web. But yeah, so I kind of feel a little blessed by having been through a couple of these frothy periods, so that I can both live with both thoughts in my head. One is that there's a lot of, I won't say a lot of BS going on here, but at the same time there's something here. Those two thoughts can be kept in the same head. Yeah.
I completely agree, Andy. And I think it'll be, to your point around your letter to your 17-year-old self, I think it'll be really interesting for you to listen back to this when your 70-year-old self and see how much, see what the world has changed, see how much of this has come to being. And I think my last question sort of on this area, and it almost brings us back to the audience, for this podcast, consulting firms. We talked about the ones you've worked with. I have listeners in big firms like, Accenture, like Frog, all the way down to much smaller boutique, sort of 10, 20, 50 people firms. And this might be too big or a too early question, but given all of the channels you're working in at Journey, given things like metaverse, voice, crypto, actually from a B2B perspective, for consulting firms who are trying to attract new commercial clients, actually, how can they be thinking about this? Can they start to be using certain channels? Is it too early? Sort of what's your take on this for the consulting industry?
Well, it's a little hard because the touch points I'm focusing on are sort of more definitely B2C oriented versus a B2B. It seems like on the B2B side, there are some related activities. So if you look at metaverse, and the technologies there, you do have technologies like Epic, which owns Fortnite, but also owns Unreal, which is a technology used to build 3D twins. with a very high fidelity. Now, this is going to take off pretty dramatically. It's just in the beginning of taking off, and we may have some announcements here shortly about companies and Unreal and so forth. So what's going to happen is everything will be created. And Unreal won't be the only technology, but in Unreal environments. And then two things will be done with that. One is you can use that to basically, look at supply chain, look at throughput, look at traffic flow, look at all these things in a simulation that, just is like almost one for one. And you can build physical and you can build meta. And it all comes out of a one design, one build piece of creative work done in Unreal. And so I know that, the larger firms like an Accenture and so forth are using some of these technologies, not just to build, fun environments for kids to go, do metaverse playgrounds. They're also doing it to build a factory floor and look at the flows and adjust those flows without having to, actually start physically building yet. And then I think the other uses are that I see consulting firms is on the enterprise side. So, learning, onboarding, more sophisticated meetings than Teams. All those things I think are very realistic applications of, AR, VR, and so forth. And I know Accenture just going to know a little bit better as they bought, I think it's publicly announced, they bought 60,000 Oculus headsets, which they're using for training and onboarding people, things like that. So those are some of the opportunities from both in the using for yourself, but then getting your enterprise clients to, they're going to hire consultants to help them implement it. It's not what we do at Journey. Our focus is, much more in creating B2C worlds than the B2B side.
No, and thank you for that, because I think, like you say, for those who do play in the B2B space, those are some fascinating areas. I had heard of Unreal, but I wasn't familiar with the usage. And I think, like you say, actually, particularly in large scale operations consulting, if you're trying to manage your map a factory floor, if you can visualize that and run that as a sort of virtual world, that opens up a whole load of possibilities. And like you say, the enterprise side as well for larger clients, larger firms. And yes, the consulting service lines that will be needed to sustain these. For anyone young listening to this, there's probably a whole practice to be built in Unreal or in, virtual onboarding. So I love those, Andy. I think, because I'm very conscious of time, we could talk for hours on all of these. And, there's probably a conversation for us at some point, online or offline, about the sort of the journey you've been on over the last 10 years and actually how that's helped you. Because I think the whole conversation's been fascinating, that early part. And, I know you said it was a little woo-woo, but I think it's really valuable to talk about and share with our listeners. So thank you for that. But I'm going to come to my last questions, Andy. And these are things I ask all of my guests. I'm interested in your answers because of some of the things we've covered. So the first one is books. And this is what I ask all my guests, and it's really, what is the book or books that have either had the most impact on you or you've gifted to others most often?
And of course, I'm not going to say Journey, because that would
I've just assumed Journey would be top of the list.
A book that I've shared with a number of people is The Year of Magical Thinking, Joan Didion, which is a book about her husband passed away suddenly in front of her with a massive heart attack. And she's a brilliant, American writer, screenplay writer, recently passed away. The book is about the year after he passed. And what I think is brilliant about it is if I were to come up with a stupid way to think about it, live life as if every second of it is the last second. And she writes it in an incredibly beautifully compelling way through the story of her first year without her husband, and her husband, her roommate, her soulmate, and how precious time is. So that would be one on the book side.
Amazing. That's it's not a book I know, and it sounds fantastic. So I've just Googled it here to have a look. I'm on holiday next week, so that is one I'm going to add, because yes, I think to some of the things we've talked about around trusting the universe, knowing yourself, time is not always as long as we think we do have. So that's amazing. Any other books before I move on, or is that the main one you'd want to leave us with?
That's probably the main one, yeah.
Fantastic. Well, and I will, Andy, put a link. I know you didn't recommend it, but I will put a link to your novel as well, because I know we've talked about that. And then the very last question, and this again it could be recapping things you've talked about, it could be new things, but it's to get your advice. So you have 3 people in front of you, and I'll use Accenture parlance for ease. So one is an analyst, they've just got out of college, they're just getting into that sort of first role. One is that manager grade, so they're senior enough to have options, but they're still fairly junior. And the third is someone who is approaching partner. So, they're making that step up. And the question is, what one piece of advice would you give to each of them?
Well, it does go back to some of the original things we said, because I think the piece of advice actually remains the same regardless of those levels, which is, what voice are you listening to as you're making decisions about your career or even decisions about what you do that day? And what voice are you listening to? And yes, you should be listening and taking advantage of, say, at a place like Accenture, you're surrounded by brilliant people, experienced people, very successful people. But there's only one voice that is your voice, and make sure you listen to that voice as well. Because I do think in that kind of environment, you can get drowned out. You can get drowned out because you've got 20 incredibly brilliant partners who are just so successful and articulate. And you're just, little Andy or little Nick, but that's the most important voice you need to listen to. So that's my advice.
Amazing, Andy. Well, I think a brilliant place to finish. And yes, I think a really nice message as well, because it is so true. It's always easy to look up and think others have more, better, have the, know the right path. And like you say, as long as you trust in yourself, I think, that's the best route. So thank you for that. And not so much a question, but as a last piece, if anyone who's listened to this wants to find out more about yourself, about Journey, where would you point them to? Where can they get in touch?
Sure. Well, I think in terms of Journey, we're at journey.world is our URL. In terms of myself, I'm pretty good about responding to LinkedIn messages. So I would suggest just go to my LinkedIn, and I do respond to any message, or even if it's, something like I'm not interested in whatever it is. So I'd suggest LinkedIn for me, journey.world is the URL. And then, if you're interested in the book, if you just Google Amazon, Andrew Zimmerman Journey, you'll see the book.
Amazing, Andy. We'll put links to all of those in the show notes so people can find you, find Journey, and find your book. And that has been a brilliant conversation. So thank you so much for giving your time, Andy. I know you're exceptionally busy at the moment. All that's left to say is thank you and all the best for the rest of your week.
Well, thanks, Nick, and thanks for letting me share both, the professional and personal side of things. And I really enjoyed this.
Thanks a lot. I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Climbing Consulting. If you have any guest recommendations, comments, ideas, thoughts on how I can make this show better for you, just drop me an email. It's nick@createengage.co.uk, and I really look forward to hearing from you.